That was an important area of testimony right there, because what the prosecution wants to say is that she was strangled, placed in that car, and left to die when she was ultimately set on fire. So if you could see, based upon the areas where she was not burned, that would help the prosecution's case. I want to talk more about the details of the trial so far with criminal defense attorney Marni Snyder, a very special guest joining us right now. Thanks. How are you doing, Marni Jo? It's great to have you here on Law and Crime.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so as I look back on yesterday's testimony, I can't tell if that was a good day for the prosecution or a bad day, because a number of the witnesses they called, I'm not sure if they helped their case. What do you think?
Well, I think that the jury is probably going to be looking at the quality of evidence, not the quantity. And that's the defense attorney's job to point out what witness's testimony just isn't important, that it can be ignored completely, or that it was only given by the prosecution in order to inflame their passions. Some of the ME's testimony, in fact, that doesn't deal with their theory about where the burns were not found on her body. That kind of thing is needs to be pointed out by the defense, that it's not important. We all think that this is a horrific crime. What we're here to decide is who did it. As far as yesterday's testimony, I don't think it was used to the optimal amount. People that were saying that she whispered Eric or said Eric seem to be very clear that that is what they heard, and they are sticking by that statement. And so the fact that there were many witnesses that said that is both a quantity and quality, theory for them.
Right, and it's not like they all coordinated that. They heard this either at the same time or separate times, and they all heard the same thing. So when you had the speech pathologist testify the first day and say, well, it's impossible for her to make out any kind of words, doesn't that take away from what the first responders who were right there, right next to Jessica, ultimately said?
Well, I think it's interesting in the order which they called witnesses, the prosecution called witnesses in this case, because I'm not sure that what the pathologist said took away. I think that the first responders might have taken away something from the pathologist's testimony. So, for example, she's saying, yes, this didn't happen, but at all times has to admit she wasn't there. And a medical certainty is not an absolute 100% scientific certainty. And so for everyone to say, yeah, but in this case, I heard, really probably detracted from her statement. So I think it's interesting they called the pathologist first. I think it would have been interesting to kind of set the basis that, oh, they're just hearing whispering. They're hearing like strange things that are coming from the vocal cords. Then the pathologist could have said, well, you're hearing gurgles and things that aren't really words, because it would have been impossible. Instead, they did it in the other order.
Yeah, it's an interesting strategy how that happened. This has been a very interesting strategy moving forward. I mean, trying to understand the prosecution's case in chief and what the defense will ultimately do. We're going to take a quick break on our end, but when we come back, we're going to play more of the testimony from the medical examiner. Stay tuned. Welcome back, everybody. Okay, so this is the medical examiner explaining the cause of death of Jessica Chambers. But there's a lot of questions that we have after yesterday's testimony for all the witnesses. I want to bring back in Marni Snyder. One of the key witnesses yesterday by the prosecution, talked about it earlier with Kathy Russin, is a witness we didn't see the first time around. This woman who says that she gave a hitchhiker a ride that night in the very area where Jessica Chambers was attacked. I'm curious, from your perspective, did that help the prosecution or did it help the defense?
It all depends on how they spin it at closing arguments, and how they can convince the jury that it fits into the pieces. I think it's interesting that she didn't identify him. She was looking at him right there in front of the jurors in the courtroom and didn't point him out as the man that she gave a ride to. But the nature of hitchhiking is that there was someone from out of town that we know of from her testimony as a black male of medium or small build, or maybe shorter, that was around the town that night. And that points to the fact that someone who is not from this tight-knit community was there and could have committed the crime. So the fact that she didn't point him out is very strange. Now, obviously, the prosecution's going to be saying that's the way that he got away from the crime scene, and this is just a piece of the puzzle and the timeline of Quentin Charles doing the murder that we need to present you as the prosecution. So it can
but at the end of the day, at the end of the day, if you're the defense, you love to say, hey, somebody else did it. So if you have the Eric or Derek, on top of this mysterious hitchhiker, if I'm sitting in the jury, I'm starting to think, wait a second, what's going on here?
You have an entire new avenue because now you have two people to point to: your Eric Derrick guy and the hitchhiker. And because the Commonwealth, because the state has the burden of proof, any holes that they can poke and alternate theories that they can present are good. And this is a nice one because they don't have to come off of the main fact that this is an identification case. Nothing's going to happen with that main theory. Yeah. Now they just have two others to point to. Yeah. So they can absolutely give a beautiful closing there that incorporates that hitchhiker without losing their main theory of the Eric Derrick person having done it.
Well, the closings will be something to watch. We got some more evidence to talk about. In fact, let's continue on with Dr. Erin Barnhart, the forensic pathologist, the medical examiner in this case, where she continues her examination and tries to talk about some of the injuries sustained by Jessica Chambers, which really helps understand what condition she was ultimately in. Take a look. Okay, so Marni, Joe, you heard what I just heard. Perhaps it's possible Jessica Chambers was not injured in such a way where she couldn't make out these words. I mean, yes, her words were extremely garbled, but what you heard from first responders was that they were able to make out some words and maybe not others. So what are we supposed to take from this?
Well, what you heard from first responders is it's really interesting because they don't talk about how she repeated the name over and over to each of them. They were all there and they were all able to hear this name at the same time. And I think that that's really interesting. They didn't agree together as to what the name was that was said. They gave independent testimony, and there wasn't a suspect at the time they gave that name. So their testimony is really credible. We have to understand that when an expert testifies, it should be important, but an expert's testimony is still going to be weighed by the jury like anyone else's, and the jury can disbelieve an expert. Because what an expert is really giving is speculation, because they weren't there. It's just highly educated speculation in the context of their education and their experience in their field. Right. So if the jury says, you know, she wasn't there, and I know that she thinks that there could be this damage, but I think I heard it, they can believe that. In this testimony, you hear that the tongue wasn't damaged, and at the first trial especially, and I don't know how much it got to happen yesterday, they talked about where the tongue connects to certain vocal cords is a really important place to be able to make sound.
Right, and so, we're going to play that right now, where the medical examiner talks about the muscle not being damaged. But before we play it, I warn our viewers right now, this is a very graphic image of Jessica Chambers. So we're going to play that right now, and we'll talk more about it. Take a look. I really have no words after seeing that. That is extremely, extremely tough to look at. And you think about what this young girl went through. It's unbelievable to think about. And you also have to imagine that the jury's not only seeing this, but her family are seeing these photos once again in the retrial. Marni, Joe, how difficult is it for this family in the sense that, yes, a retrial is tough because they didn't get some sort of answer the first time around, but it's also difficult because they have to see all of this evidence and all of this testimony once again.
Right, and they're seeing it also with new questions being asked and new theories that they might not agree with or feel like they're being cheated. It's probably very hard for the family. In a retrial, defense attorneys are allowed to come up with new theories. Commonwealth, that the state is allowed to bring in new evidence. And sometimes I can imagine that a victim's family must feel confused about what that means going forward. They must feel like a bit of unfairness is there. But investigation is allowed to go on between two trials, and new witnesses are allowed to come forward, and they should be incorporated into what the jury can know. The family needs to remember, if it's any solace at all to them, that the jury is only considering what's happening in the courtroom.
Right, as they should. I mean, there are details we know about Quentin Tellis that the jury does not know, that and ultimately he was charged in connection with the stabbing death of a 34-year-old Taiwanese student. They won't know that. I wonder right now if we have time to play the next clip, which I want to do, is the speech-language pathologist. I'd like to play that. Yeah, let's go there. So again, we talk so much about this speech-language pathologist who was brought in by the prosecution. Let's see if, based upon what you just saw, Was Jessica Chambers, did she have the ability to make out words? Let's see. Why do you think that the prosecution in the first trial didn't bring her forward? Did they realize maybe it was the impact of how important those first responders' testimony ultimately was?
I think it is. I think the impact of the first responders is huge. And I think it still might be huge. She's saying that Jessica couldn't have made any sounds at all. But the first responders have said she asked for water. The first responders have said she said Eric. The jury is then going to think to themselves, does that make sense, right? And so they're going to say to themselves, someone who is burned is going to be dehydrated. That makes perfect sense that a victim of any sort of burns or inhalation would ask for water. And it also makes sense that someone, if they thought they were dying, would do anything possible to get out that last word to identify their killer.
Yeah, in a way, is it discounting the adrenaline and the courage of this 19-year-old girl to try to do something to try to save herself, to try to explain what happened? I mean, isn't that a factor, a human factor that you just can't explain?
Right. Well, and the law takes that into account. The reason that what Jessica said when she is obviously deceased and not subject to cross-examination is allowed to be considered by the jury is it's because it's considered a dying declaration. That last moment before someone dies, what they say is not formulated to be a lie. And they are discounting that adrenaline. The fact that she walked out of that car to talk to first responders is huge. But it's all about how they argue at the end.
Yep, can't argue with that. I can't argue with that on that closing arguments. Listen, when we get back, we're going to play a little bit more of the defense really picking at the police investigation here, which became a big issue in the first trial. So we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime. All right, so that's the defense picking up problems in the police investigation. Jessica Chambers' keys were played around with by this young girl and was in the possession of somebody else before it was actually handed over to the police. It sounds like they're trying to go with this issue of contamination. I want to bring back in criminal defense attorney Marni Snyder. Now, I have seen a lot of cases where the defense says this was an improper investigation. And maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But here, this seems to be good grounds for that. But I'm curious your perspective on it.
Well, you can do it two different ways. You can say it's improper investigation or just that it wasn't thorough in any sense. And I think that's what they did in that first clip, is they said, you actually took out a camera and took pictures of something that doesn't have relevance. The relevant part was before when he found them on the side of the road and walking with him to retrace those steps, to take pictures of that area, and to document that all in reports for people to be able to reinvestigate later. That's an appropriate investigation, and that's really what they're dealing with there. And you can't date and time DNA.
Right.
So if Mr. Charles's DNA is on there, the defense has to show that there's a possibility that it could have innocently been on there. If someone can pick up keys on the side of the road, still doesn't think it's important, takes it home and touches it, Trellis could have done that to anyone, could have. And so it shows that the keys weren't ever secure before or after the murder, maybe, and DNA can get on them in any way.
Yeah, and there's a lot that we're going to pinpoint about the defense saying, hey, this investigation, there's some issues, including, did you thoroughly investigate other suspects? But I want to continue on right now with the testimony of Deputy Chuck Tucker from the Panola County Sheriff's Department. This is a discussion about the crime scene and how it was investigated. Take a look. That was an interesting piece of testimony where this witness said, hey, listen, I asked her if she knew who this Eric was, or did you know who the last name was? And she said no. So if Jessica Chambers clearly knew who Quentin Tellis was, it becomes an issue of, was she really identifying Tellis or somebody else? But I'm back here with Marni Snyder. One of the key aspects, and I want to ask your perspective on it, is did they thoroughly investigate other Erics or Derricks, and what does it really mean to clear someone from an investigation? Because that's what we're going to hear later on.
Yeah, they're going to say that they interviewed, hundreds of Erics and Derricks, all the ones that they could find in the town. And that's why this hitchhiker development is really so kind of exciting. It's exciting now for two reasons. She doesn't know the last name because it's not someone from her town. It's this hitchhiker coming through. So this even gives the defense more of an argument at closing that it's someone that they didn't know. But as far as clearing, they're looking for someone who could substantiate an alibi. in this case, if they just talk to hundreds of Eric and Dereks that have no connection to her, this is going to be the testimony that makes that okay. The police can defend their police work by saying, well, she didn't know a last name, we had to keep
right.
going.
And that defense we're going to have to see again as we move forward. Now, we're going to take a quick break, but here's a short preview of a special on Jessica Chambers. Take a look. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this witness. Marni Jo Snyder's back with us. Again, what are we supposed to make from it?
I'm not sure. I think that it's very odd that the prosecution called her and didn't have her point out Mr. Tellis. I don't see what she adds to it. The defense can say it doesn't make sense that someone kills someone and then hitchhikes in order to get around to finish covering up their crime. That makes no sense. If their allegation is that he was hitchhiking after the fire part, why didn't they ask about the smells of an accelerant or smoke or something like that? If it was after just the alleged strangulation part, who hitchhikes to go pick up a gas can? And if her body is limp and she's passed out, why not steal her car to go get the trash can, the gas can, or is it moved? It just doesn't make a lot of sense with the prosecution's theory.
So I'll tell you the answer that a lot of people, my guests, say is that criminals, people who commit these crimes, are not rocket scientists. You know, they're not thinking all the avenues out 20 steps ahead. That could be an answer. One of the weird things is this Julia Chambers is a distant relative. Oh, hello there. Welcome to Law and Crime. No, this is one of the things is that this distant relative, this Julia Chambers, is a distant relative of Quentin Tellis. So that's a little weird. Right.
But then they need to point out, what is the date that she was approached by law enforcement to give her statement and all of those details? How is her statement really being formed, right? So if she's giving this statement months or years after the crime, what's her memory like? And how has it been impacted by the fact that they already have a suspect? So when the ATF approached her, are they trying to get to Quentin Tellis? Did they put something in her head? Is that statement, oh, I'm Julia's cousin, is that a reliable portion of this story? Or really, is she someone who they figured out picked up a hitchhiker from surveillance cameras? So it's all about how she came to be a witness in this case.
Right, and that's the big issue here because she didn't testify in the first trial.
Right, exactly.
Right. I want to play the testimony of another witness, Will Turner, who said that he witnessed this suspicious man at the crime scene. Let's play some of that testimony. Okay, so we're seeing this back and forth between the prosecution and the defense. Let's try to make some sense of it with criminal defense attorney Marni Jo Snyder. So, Marni Jo, what is really happening here? I think there's some objection to the testimony from yesterday, to the crime scene today that the jury will visit.
Right.
What's going on?
There's a lot going on this morning, and unfortunately the audio wasn't perfect, so I could only get a sense of some of the things. And the judge did mention earlier that he might decide to hold things under advisement to see whether they become more relevant as the day goes on. One of the things that I thought was really interesting is that they want to do these site visits to show where the keys were dropped and where they were found and where the hitchhiker was picked up. It's very rare that a jury gets to go out on all of these field trips. And the prosecution was talking about recreating the sounds of that night. That's really very strange.
But isn't it important? Because you have to understand, what did these first responders hear? Maybe it was a chaotic environment.
Right. And that's for the jury to kind of take notice of based on people's testimony. But normally a jury doesn't get to relive the events of that evening. That's very strange because people can change what's going on, right? That's why we don't rely on that. So we're supposed to be evaluating the witnesses and how they say things were. To recreate the scene, you're recreating from the perspective of tons of first responders.
Right.
So which person's theory about how loud it was do you get to pick? Well, the prosecution picks the guy that said it was the loudest. The defense wants to pick the guy that says it was the quietest. Sometimes we have to rely on this system, on people's testimony, and thinking about whether or not they were able to see what they say they said and hear what they say they heard. You can't just recreate a crime.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. This case is unique from a lot of different perspectives. Marni Jo Snyder, thanks so much for coming here on Law and Crime to help us explain more about this case.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to get back to court.
Okay, enjoy. All right, everybody, we are going to take a quick break, but when we come back, a lot more to discuss, and Jessica Chambers and Brett Kavanaugh. We'll be right back.